Mark Wallace, let's start with you. Your thoughts on all this?
I think it's very hard to see this just as a standalone event. The fact is that what we're seeing now is the result of over 14 years of appeasing Vladimir Putin's Kremlin. In 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia and still occupies a large chunk of that country, I've been to the line of occupation to visit the trenches with Georgian troops and police forces there, looking at part of their own country still occupied by Russia. Nothing was done to support them. Vladimir Putin has already invaded Ukraine. It's 8 years ago, 2014, when Russia invaded
Crimea,
Ukraine.
Talking about.
Well, not just Crimea. Remember, Vladimir Putin sponsored, helped to train, arm and propped up the Donbass, the so-called separatists, who incidentally blasted British and other civilians out of the sky on a civilian airliner in Ukrainian airspace. There's been a land war in Europe, in Ukraine's territory, since 2014. So when you see Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, deny any intention, it's worth remembering that in 2014 they denied any intention to invade Ukraine, and then they did it. Since then they've been denying that they did it, even though their troops are still there, while at home Vladimir Putin boasts to his people that they've seized parts of Ukraine and incorporated them, hijacked them, annexed them into the territory of Russia. So what we're seeing ultimately is part of the Kremlin's old game, really, which is lying liars and the lies they tell. And you have to see why, which is that they want, just as Mark White said, to try to increase their own clout and to distract, of course, as ever, from growing problems at home.
Marianne?
It's exactly right. It's a policy of destabilising the West as well, I think. It's the kind of the big international chess game where Russia can turn towards China, perhaps, and establish stronger allyship there. And he's testing the mettle of the UK, the US, and the rest of the West, including NATO and its allies, the allies that comprise NATO. Fundamentally, diplomacy and sanctions diplomacy only works if the other person is sort of honestly at the table and is fearful of the reprisals. Putin doesn't want to do that. He doesn't think that we'll follow through. He doesn't think we've got appetite for war, which rightly we don't. But we have to prove that if it comes to it, we will call his bluff. And my concern is that NATO is, to some extent, more getting its ducks in a row. Everybody's singing off the same hymn sheet, a little more than they were perhaps 2 weeks ago. But this is the point where Russia is now escalating the threat to the Ukraine. They're doing military operations with Belarus. They're circling Ukraine. People in Kiev are having to sit down tonight, have conversations with their kids over the dinner table about what happens when the war begins. That is terrifying. And you're right, there's been a land war in Europe up till now. It's just that we've sort of forgotten because it hasn't been relevant enough to us. Of course it is. Russia are a major threat to democracy.
Gareth?
It's true that you can't understand this situation without looking back a little bit in history. And I think what, so far, both of you seem to be ignoring is that NATO undertook not to expand in that part of Europe. And it has. And it's doing everything it can to expand. And obviously Putin's got wound up about that. And we've had probably 5-6 years, I think, of stories about, look at the number of troops that Putin's got on the border. When you go and investigate those stories, certainly in the past, those troops were in barracks miles and miles from the border. They weren't doing anything that could be interpreted as hostile action.
They're not doing that now, though.
And they are occupying parts of Ukraine and Georgia. They've been shipped into Kazakhstan to shoot protesters in the streets in order to prop up another of Vladimir Putin's allies. They're deployed in Armenia after Russia waited while Armenia was in such sufficiently weak position in its war against Azerbaijan about 18 months ago to have to rely on Kremlin security guarantees, which happened to come with yet more territorial military placements. But on that point about NATO expansion, I think you're right, this does get to the nub of what the Kremlin claims its issue is. But ultimately, when the Kremlin says, well, NATO should not expand to, for example, Eastern Europe, to Poland or the Baltics or Hungary or Czechia or potentially, say, Ukraine or Georgia, what's it saying? It says that Russia should have a veto over the foreign security policy of its neighbours. And I think the problem is Russia needs to learn that it has not... once upon a time, it conquered these countries. It occupied them with hostile troops and kept them under its heel for decades as part of the Soviet Union. They're not its slaves anymore. It doesn't own these countries, and they have a right to their own foreign policy. If you join a defensive alliance, why is that a threat to a peace-loving Russia?
I think fundamentally, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Gareth, come back on that.
I mean, I'm not going to sit here and be an apologist for Putin. I mean, he's a belligerent kind of guy. But I think this does not make sense if we try and understand it as suddenly a big threat, the threat of World War III, as you described it in your intro, Michelle. Trying to understand it that way just does not make sense. Sure, war could come about, because if we keep this stance towards Russia, if we keep having Western leaders going out and meeting with other powers in the region and stoking up the rhetoric, then, yeah, we may well find that all our worst fears about Putin will come true. But I think if you look at what Putin has done aggressively in the region, it tracks, over the last few years, it tracks quite well NATO's attempts to expand. I would say that we've got very short memories about threats about the most serious crisis in Europe. Very short memories about people having weapons that could reach Europe within 45 minutes. Do we remember all of those?
Whilst you're talking, by the way, Gareth, I'm just going to put, whilst you're talking, just going to put a map, actually, of NATO, just if anyone's listening, kind of wondering, or what we're talking about here, just so you can actually see the shaded areas there, by the way, are obviously NATO. Just, sorry, carry on, Gareth, but I just wanted to give some context to what you're saying on the screen.
I think it's really easy to make a case that dangerous, troublesome things are happening in parts of the world that could threaten our security. The reality is Biden, although he's a Democrat, has always been a hawk. He was very aggressive about what should happen in the Middle East. He's just withdrawn.
He's just withdrawn from Afghanistan.
Exactly. He's withdrawn from Afghanistan in that situation that was going nowhere. It feels to me like with his popularity sliding at home, he's doing what leaders have done through the ages, which is to start a nice conflict elsewhere in Europe to detract from the problems he's having at home. And I think the Afghanistan withdrawal is easily seen as part of that.
I think the Afghanistan withdrawal is shameful, but I think the idea that Biden might be fanning the flames in Europe in order to distract from his issues or to have a nice conflict. I mean, there's nothing that will be nice about Russia invading Ukraine, because the Ukrainians will fight and die. The Russians will fight and die. And the thing that we mustn't forget, I think, Michelle, is that obviously the thing that feels most visceral is the physical theatre of war. These images of soldiers with guns and tanks in the snow. It feels like the Cold War. It feels like the Second World War. The other thing we need to remember is that Russia have many other avenues of waging war with democracy and with the West. That's cyber attacks. They hold a lot of the cards in terms of the global energy security. They can turn the tap off for gas to Ukraine overnight and people will freeze in their homes. And we can't ignore the fact that they have incredible strength to hijack our democracy in ways that aren't as immediate as a tank on the border. I mean, they did the same Brexit. They've done the same with our party, with our
Hang on,
democratic
what do you
elections.
mean they did the same with Brexit?
Well, they funded campaigns that affected the way that the British public, our free-minded citizens, voted in ways that were not legal.
Absolutely no evidence of that. That's completely debunked. But it does sit nicely as an example of this continually talking up the Russian bear threat to distract from other issues.
But the Russian bear threat, I mean, you said earlier the idea that this is kind of a paper tiger or a paper bear, the Russian threat. This is, after all, the thug state which deployed a radioactive poison on the streets of London. This is the state that deployed Novichok on the streets of Salisbury.
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier the British and other civilians blowing out the sky over Ukraine. It ought to concern us, I think, when a country like Ukraine, for the supposed sin in the Kremlin's eyes of wanting to have an independent policy of its own, which doesn't simply do what the Kremlin wants, should be subject to invasion, occupation and further threat. If it does not concern us about the plight of the Ukrainians, it certainly should concern us if you keep appeasing a state like this, eventually it ends up on your doorstep.
This word appeasement, references to the Second World War, it all seems to be going in a certain direction. I don't deny that the situation is extremely tense and could go into conflict seemingly at any moment. I don't deny that. I'm just saying we need to look very carefully at where the responsibility lies. And even the Ukrainian president, just the other day, issued a statement to Washington to dial down the rhetoric. So if anyone is trying to talk up the possibility of war, I happen to think it's not Putin in this situation.
100,000 Russian troops, it's air assault brigades being moved to Belarus, it's the Russian Navy steaming around the Crimea. Those are real things, they're not rhetoric.
But what Gareth's saying is that he's been almost, forgive me if I'm paraphrasing you incorrectly, but as I'm interpreting what you're saying, he's almost doing that in response, as opposed to
I'm sorry, but he is. I mean, the interesting question is, let's take this hypothetically. If he's doing this in response to the menacing prospect of his neighbours joining a purely defensive alliance, when Russia opposed the Baltic states joining NATO, when it opposed Hungary or Poland joining NATO, if we'd listened then and we allowed Russia to carry out a veto on the foreign and domestic and international and defence policies of Eastern European countries, do we really think that Putin would be sitting at home saying, all right, lads, put your feet up, we're not going to go on any foreign adventures? Do we really think that? What happened in Georgia or Ukraine was not provocation. The reason why his neighbours want to join a defensive alliance is he's an aggressive tyrant.
So what will happen if we continue to stoke up these tensions with Putin? He is going to move further towards China. So that potentially makes the whole situation just a lot more worse, doesn't it? There's no way that in bringing on a conflict with Putin makes this situation better.
This is about deterring a conflict.
Yeah, this is a conversation that was had in 2008 when Georgia fell. This was a conversation that was had again in 2014 when Crimea and the Donbass fell. And nothing happened, nothing changed. Russia did not sit back on its heels. They continued to intimidate and threaten, to undermine democracy in their neighbours. And as you say, Mark, I think you're absolutely right. NATO is a defensive alliance. The only reason you wouldn't want the Ukraine to join is because you know that if you then invade Ukraine, you have all of NATO at your gate with their guns armed and ready.
Final word to you on this, Gareth.
NATO is clearly a threat to Putin. If NATO seeks to increase its dominance in the region against what it promised to do, Putin is bound to get belligerent, and that will push him towards China.
Well, there you go. Lots of differing opinions, lots of opinions as well coming through on the emails. Mark says, well, we wouldn't have to worry about COVID or gas prices if we went to war with Russia. That would be the least of our worries. Trevor says, well, had Trump still been in the White House, neither Russia nor China. No, basically, I think what Trevor's point is, none of this would be going on if you had Donald Trump at the helm. What do you think to that one? And Ian says, when it comes to who is warmongering here, it is the media. There you go, that's Ian's view. Keep your thoughts coming in.